quiet of a suburban neighborhood. Back in 1986, a 12-year-old girl disappeared. She had laced up her pink and blue rollerblades and waved goodbye to her parents, bound for a nearby friend's house. But she never made it. Hours later, the friend's mother called to ask if Emily still planned to come over. Panic set in. But by then, it was already too late. Emily Grace Whitmore had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind only haunting silence and a trail of unanswered questions. 2 decades passed with no sign, no closure. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, in a sleepy Oregon town, far from the echoes of their grief, her parents spotted something in an antique shop window. Something that turned their world upside down. The sunlight filtered through the towering trees of Fern Creek, casting a golden haze over the quaint streets. It was just past 2 p.m. The town, nestled in the lush folds of the Pacific Northwest, thrived on its nostalgic charm. Cobblestone paths led through a market square bustling with life, laughter, conversation, and the rustling of canvas stalls selling everything from handmade soaps to heirloom tomatoes. The air was fragrant with pine and the tang of citrus preserves. Locals wandered leisurely, sampling artisan cheese and admiring vibrant bouquets of wildflowers. Among the crowd, Robert Whitmore shuffled a few paces behind his wife, his posture rigid, shoulders hunched as if weighed down by more than the backpack slung across them. His eyes, dull with fatigue and years of sorrow, barely registered the joyful energy around him. "I still don't understand why we had to come all the way out here, Helen," he muttered under his breath, his tone low but tinged with irritation. His words were soft enough to avoid attracting attention, but sharp enough to cut through his wife's attempt at peace. Helen, standing at a stall adorned with hand-thrown pottery, gently traced the rim of a pale blue bowl. Her fingers lingered on the cool ceramic as she exhaled slowly, her patience a thin thread she refused to let snap. "We've talked about this, Robert. It's a holiday, our first in years. Fern Creek is beautiful. Just try, please, to enjoy it." It had taken Helen nearly a decade to convince him to go anywhere that wasn't tied to memories or shadows. Their home back in Rockford, Illinois, had become less of a house and more of a tomb. Every photo frame, every piece of furniture, bore the silent weight of their daughter's absence. Emily Grace, their only child, had been a burst of light in their lives, a girl with boundless curiosity and laughter that filled rooms like sunshine. But that light had been extinguished 20 years ago on a day that had begun so ordinarily. She had left home in rollerblades, her ponytail swinging, headed for a friend's birthday party just 2 blocks away. Emily never arrived. No signs, no screams, no witnesses. Just vanished. In the wake of her disappearance, Robert had retreated into himself. He functioned, he worked, he ate, but he no longer lived. Joy felt like a betrayal. He never smiled, he rarely spoke, and he had never allowed himself to let go of the desperate hope that one day, somehow, they'd find her. Helen, too, had suffered. The ache never truly faded, but over time the sharp edges had softened. In the last year, something had shifted within her. Not a return to happiness, but the realization that staying frozen in grief was not what Emily would have wanted. Emily had loved life too much for them to bury themselves in sadness forever. So Helen began nudging at the locked doors of Robert's sorrow, trying to coax him back into the world. This trip to Oregon, so far removed from their routines and memories, was her most ambitious attempt yet. She'd chosen Fern Creek for its peaceful charm and natural beauty, a place where the past couldn't haunt them so easily, or so she'd thought. As they continued down the main street, lined with red maples and thick-boughed firs, Robert's gaze, usually locked on the pavement, caught on something across the way. It was a storefront, modest and weathered, painted in a shade of green dulled by time. Above the door, whimsical gold lettering, slightly peeling, spelled out, "Timber Treasures." The display windows were cluttered with a strange and eclectic assortment. Tarnished brass trinkets, brittle hardcover books stacked precariously, a porcelain doll missing an eye, and bizarre tools whose purposes had long since faded from memory. It was the kind of place that collected other people's forgotten lives. Helen's eyes lit up. "Oh, Robert, look, that place looks charming. You know how I adore vintage things. It's like stepping into the past. Just a quick peek?" Robert's expression didn't change. His lips tightened. "You go ahead," he replied flatly. "I'll wait out here. That place looks like it smells of mildew and dust. Not for me." Helen hesitated, disappointment flickering in her eyes, but she nodded with a quiet smile. "All right. I won't be long." She crossed the street, her steps light and almost playful as she disappeared through the door of Timber Treasures. The old bell above it jingled faintly in the warm breeze. Robert exhaled slowly and leaned against a lamp-post. He reached for his cigarettes, tapping one from the pack with mechanical ease, but just before the lighter sparked, something caught his eye. His gaze drifted to the shop's dusty window. Amid the cluttered chaos, wedged between a rusted teapot and a broken mannequin torso, sat a pair of rollerblades, small, child-sized. The colors were unmistakable, pink boots with turquoise wheels and thick purple straps. Time had worn them down, the plastic was scratched, the colors dulled, but still his heart slammed against his ribs. He froze. His cigarette drooped from his lips unlit and forgotten. He stepped forward, drawn like a man in a trance. With each step, memories crashed over him. The birthday morning when Emily had unwrapped those rollerblades, her delighted squeal. The way she had hugged him so hard she nearly knocked him over. She'd spent the entire day gliding up and down their street, pink helmet strapped on, wobbling at first and then speeding away, laughing. He remembered everything, because he had picked those out, not just a similar pair, those exact skates. He moved closer, pressing his face against the dusty glass, hands trembling as they cupped the edges of the display. The skates were unmistakable, the same deep scuff mark on the right toe, the faded sticker of a cartoon unicorn on the ankle strap. He felt the ground tilt beneath him. "No," he whispered, his voice a breath of disbelief. "It can't be." He didn't think. His body moved before his mind could catch up. The instant recognition had short-circuited everything else. Robert yanked open the antique shop's door with such force that the bell above it gave a startled jangle, loud and abrupt against the stillness inside. He stepped across the threshold, his breath ragged, his eyes wild as they swept the dimly lit interior. Shadows stretched across dusty shelves, the scent of old paper, brass, and forgotten decades hanging thick in the air. His gaze locked on the man behind the counter, a balding, middle-aged figure with tired eyes and a permanently furrowed brow. Helen, near the back, had been admiring a display of vintage radios when she heard the bell. She turned, startled by her husband's sudden appearance. "Robert?" she called, her voice rising with alarm. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" But he didn't respond. His focus had zeroed in entirely on the shopkeeper. Striding to the counter, he leaned in close, the urgency in his voice making the man straighten. "The rollerblades," Robert said hoarsely, the words scraping out of his throat. "In the window. I need to see them. Now." The shopkeeper blinked, taken aback by the demand. "Excuse me?" "I said I need to see those rollerblades from the window. Please, it's important." Helen hurried over, concern etched deep into her face. "Robert, what is it? What's going on?" "Just look," he said, barely managing the words. The shopkeeper, warily eyeing them both, shuffled toward the display window. He returned a moment later, rollerblades in hand, and set them on the counter. The second Helen's eyes fell on them, her hand flew to her mouth. Her knees nearly gave out. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They look just like Emily's. It's different people." "Size 4, he reached out, hands shaking, and lifted one of the rollerblades. He reached out and lifted one of the rollerblades. He turned it over carefully, as though handling a sacred relic. "Size 4, he whispered. "That's what I bought her." Helen laid a hand on his arm, her voice soft, pleading. "Robert, please, don't do this to yourself. Lots of kids had rollerblades like those. It's just a coincidence." But Robert wasn't listening. He turned the rollerblade over again, and his eyes searched the plastic toe guard. When he saw the faint, shallow etching, he stopped breathing. "No!" he gasped. "No! Helen, look!" He tilted the rollerblade toward her. Scratched into the worn plastic were 3 letters, EMG, Emily Grace Whitmore. Helen stared, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out, touched the carved letters with the tip of her finger, and gasped at the familiarity of them. "Oh my God, Robert! That's your handwriting! You carved those!" "I did," he said, voice breaking. "I carved them for her, right after she got them. I told her it was in case they ever got lost." His face crumpled. "These are hers. These are Emily's rollerblades." Helen's disbelief dissolved into horror. Her hand trembled as she withdrew it. "But how? How did they end up here? We're thousands of miles from Rockford." Behind the counter, the shopkeeper watched their exchange with growing discomfort. He cleared his throat. "Is there a problem?" Robert's head snapped up, his expression intense. "Yes, there's a problem. These rollerblades belong to our daughter. She disappeared 20 years ago. She was wearing them when she vanished." The shopkeeper stiffened. "I'm sorry about your daughter, but these are inventory now. If you want them, you'll have to pay the listed price." Robert stared at him in disbelief. "You're not listening. This evidence. Our daughter was abducted while wearing them." "I don't care what story you're telling," the shopkeeper said flatly. "I bought them legally. They're part of my stock. They're priced at $45. "45?" Robert repeated, stunned. "I paid less for them brand new." "Inflation?" the man shrugged. "Plus, vintage items get premium prices these days." Helen tried to intervene. She placed a hand on Robert's arm, her voice gentle. "Let's just pay for them, Robert. It doesn't matter. We'll take them and go to the police, please." "No," Robert said, his voice suddenly firm. "No, these are ours. They were stolen from us, just like Emily. I won't pay a cent." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed. "If you're not going to buy them, I'll have to ask you to leave." Robert refused. When the shopkeeper came around the counter, his intent clear, Robert stepped back, holding the rollerblades tight to his chest. "Don't touch me," he warned. "These belong to my daughter." The commotion had drawn attention. People outside the shop were beginning to gather, pressing their faces to the glass. A police officer, patrolling the market on foot, approached and stepped inside. He looked over the scene, calmly but with authority. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. The shopkeeper pointed at Robert. "This man is trying to steal from my store." "I'm not stealing anything," Robert said quickly. "These rollerblades belong to my daughter. She was wearing them the day she disappeared 20 years ago in Illinois." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Sir, if you have a claim, there are proper legal channels. You can't just take property from a shop." Robert, trembling with emotion, held the rollerblades out toward the officer. Look here, these initials. E.G.W. Emily Grace Whitmore. That's my daughter. I carved them myself. And if you check the underside, you'll find the serial number. I still have the receipt from when I bought them." The officer hesitated, peering at the carvings. His expression shifted. He stepped back and radioed dispatch, requesting records related to a long-cold missing persons case from Illinois. After a tense pause, the voice on the other end confirmed the report. There was indeed an open case that matched Robert's story. The officer's demeanor changed immediately. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "I apologize. We've confirmed there is a case. I'll need to speak with the owner of this shop." "I'm just an employee," the shopkeeper said, now clearly nervous. "The owner isn't here today." "Then I'll need their contact information," the officer said firmly. The shopkeeper hesitated before reaching under the counter and pulling out a business card. "Victor Manson. He's not going to be happy about this." "I'm confiscating these rollerblades," the officer announced. "They're now potential evidence in an active investigation." He turned to Robert and Helen. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like you to come with me to the station to provide a formal statement." As they stepped out of the shop into the bright afternoon sun, Robert felt something stir inside him, a feeling long buried beneath grief and hopelessness. It was hope. For the first time in 20 years, it flickered in his chest. Helen reached for his hand, and he squeezed hers tightly. They followed the officer, Brennan as his badge read, toward a patrol car parked at the edge of the market. Maybe, just maybe, their nightmare was no longer a dead end. They followed Officer Brennan as he led them away from the antique shop and down the sleepy length of Main Street. "It's just about 10 minutes from here," he assured them. A straight shot to the station. The Fern Creek Police Station stood at the end of the street, a modest single-story brick building with ivy curling up one side and a small American flag fluttering gently in the evening breeze. The place had a quiet, orderly feel, its neatness and simplicity standing in stark contrast to the chaotic whirlwind churning inside Robert's chest. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. The muted hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional ring of a distant phone barely registered to Robert, whose focus was still fixed on the sealed evidence bag Officer Brennan carried. The rollerblades, unmistakably Emily's, now lay within a clear plastic pouch, their scratched toe guards and faded straps visible through the plastic like echoes of a ghost long thought lost. Brennan led them down a corridor and into a small interview room. It was sparsely furnished. Just a table, 4 chairs, and a wall clock ticking steadily. The rollerblades were placed carefully in the center of the table. Robert sat down slowly, eyes never leaving the bag, while Helen folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I've contacted the detective on duty," Brennan said, drawing out a notepad and pen as he sat across from them. "He'll want to take a full statement shortly, but in the meantime I need to verify a few preliminary details." He looked up. "Can you describe your daughter as she was when she disappeared?" Robert cleared his throat, his voice raw but steady. "Emily was 12. Auburn hair, shoulder-length, green eyes. She was tall for her age, about 5'2". She had a small scar on her right forearm, from falling off our backyard fence when she was 7. Brennan nodded, scribbling notes. "And the date of her disappearance?" "June 15th, 1986, Helen replied softly. "It was a Sunday. Around 3 in the afternoon. She was heading to her friend Samantha's house, only about half a mile away. She wanted to show off her birthday gift, those rollerblades." "She never arrived," Robert added, his voice low. "We didn't suspect anything until Samantha's mom called around 5, asking if Emily was still coming over. Just then the door opened and a man in plain clothes stepped inside. He appeared to be in his 40s, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and the air of someone who had seen his share of sorrow. "I'm Detective Marshall," he said, extending a hand to each of them. "I understand you believe these rollerblades may be connected to your daughter's disappearance?" Robert pointed to the bag on the table. "They're hers, I'm sure of it." Marshall sat down, adjusting his chair. "I've already contacted the authorities in Illinois. They're sending the case files, though it may take a few hours. In the meantime, I'd like to hear everything you can share." For the next hour, Robert and Helen relived the day their world collapsed. They spoke of the massive search efforts, the flyers posted on telephone poles, the teams of volunteers scouring parks and neighborhoods. They recalled the pain of waiting by the phone, the false leads, and the empty holidays. Robert shared how he had taken a leave from work, how they'd hired private investigators when the local authorities hit a wall. "We never stopped," Robert said. "We couldn't." Detective Marshall listened with quiet focus. "And now? All these years later, you find her rollerblades in a pawn shop in Oregon. That's no coincidence. We'll start tracing their path immediately." Helen leaned forward. "The employee at the shop wasn't very cooperative. He said he didn't know where they came from." "We're looking into it," Marshall said. "I've already sent an officer to run a background check on the shop owner, Victor Manson. We'll examine their inventory records tomorrow and see what else turns up." He then carefully opened the evidence bag and removed the rollerblades with gloved hands, placing them on a sterile cloth. "We'll get them photographed, logged, and dusted for prints. It's unlikely we'll find anything after so long, but we have to try." Another officer entered, handing Marshall a folder. He opened it and scanned the contents, his brow furrowing thoughtfully. "Manson purchased timber treasures about 18 years ago," he explained. "Before that he moved around frequently. Washington, Colorado, Nevada. No criminal record, but very little documentation either. A quiet type." He flipped the folder open to a printed DMV photo and turned it toward them. "This is Victor Manson. Do either of you recognize him?" Both Robert and Helen shook their heads. The man in the photo had thin, graying hair and a flat, unreadable expression. "He's expected back in town in 2 days, according to the employee. We'll bring him in for questioning as soon as he returns." The sun had begun to set, casting long amber streaks across the walls of the police station. When their statements were completed, Marshall walked them to the front entrance. "We'll keep digging," he promised, "and tomorrow we'll revisit the shop, see if anything else stands out. Try to get some rest tonight." Outside, the sky was ablaze with the soft hues of dusk, pinks and oranges blending into a deepening indigo. Robert inhaled slowly, the air cooler now, tinged with pine and possibility. For the first time in 2 decades, they had something real. Not a theory, not a false lead, tangible evidence. But the thought of what those rollerblades might lead to, what painful truths might lie ahead, sent a chill down his spine. Helen touched his arm. "Let's go back. We should rest. It's been an overwhelming day." But Robert's eyes were already scanning the street. "I need to see it again," he said. "The shop. Maybe there's more." Helen sighed, but there was no stopping him. She recognized that resolute look. They turned toward the market once more, now mostly abandoned, the stalls packed up and the sounds of laughter and chatter gone silent. Only the restaurants remained open, warm light glowing behind their windows. As they neared Timber Treasures, they saw the shopkeeper from earlier locking the front door. He looked up and noticed them, and immediately tensed. His hands fumbled with the keys, movements hurried and anxious. "Look," Helen whispered, pointing. "Someone's coming out of the side." A narrow alley beside the shop, dim and lined with trash bins, opened to reveal a second figure. A man Robert hadn't seen before. He emerged quietly, closing the door behind him without making a sound. The man stepped out from the shadows wearing a worn leather jacket and a cowboy hat pulled low over his brow. Even with his face mostly obscured, something about his profile made Robert's stomach twist. He narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of the familiarity that prickled at the edge of his memory. "Looks like the man in the photo," Robert murmured under his breath. "The one Detective Marshall showed us, Victor Manson." Helen turned to follow his gaze, her eyes narrowing. But the detective said he wasn't supposed to be back for another 2 days. Why would the shopkeeper lie to the police? The two of them watched from across the street as the man in the cowboy hat moved toward a black sedan parked in front of a toy shop. Standing by the vehicle was another man, younger and stockier, who glanced around with obvious impatience. But what caught Robert and Helen's attention most wasn't the two men. It was the little girl standing beside them. She looked to be around 8 or 9 years old, with pale blonde hair tied into loose pigtails. The man in the cowboy hat approached her first, crouching down as if to offer a warm greeting. He extended his arms for an embrace, but the child recoiled subtly, her body stiffening as she turned her face away. When he reached out to ruffle her hair, she flinched as though from a blow. Robert's instincts flared instantly, his whole body tensing. "Something's not right," he said, his voice low, tight with unease. "That little girl's scared of him." Helen hesitated, watching closely. "We can't be sure of that," she said cautiously. "Maybe she's upset over a toy she didn't get, or maybe he's just not very warm." "No," Robert insisted. "There's something wrong with this. That girl doesn't trust him. Look at how she pulled away." The interaction played out in silence, heavy with unspoken tension. The second man opened the car door, and the little girl was gently guided, though not without resistance, into the back seat. The men got in, and the black car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the deepening twilight. Robert turned his attention back to the shopkeeper from earlier, who was briskly walking down the block toward a nearby bus stop. Without thinking, Robert broke into a jog. "Excuse me," he called. The shopkeeper turned his head, his expression hardening the moment he saw who it was. "What now?" he snapped. "The cops already got what you wanted." "That man who just left through the side door," Robert said, catching his breath. "Was that Victor Manson? The shop owner?" The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed to slits. "I don't have to answer your questions. If the police want something, they can ask me themselves." "Please," Robert pressed, stepping closer. "Was that him?" With an exaggerated sigh, the shopkeeper rolled his eyes. "Geez, you people really can't let things go. No, that wasn't the boss. That was his brother. You happy now?" He turned abruptly and climbed aboard a city bus that had just pulled up, leaving Robert standing on the sidewalk, his questions hanging in the air. Helen caught up with him just as the bus pulled away. "What did he say?" Bill trained his brother, though, agreed with him. He claims it was Manson's brother, Robert replied, frowning. But if that's true, why didn't he mention anything to the police earlier? If Manson is out of town and his brother's here, why hide it? Helen shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter. I don't know, but it's getting dark and we're both running on fumes. Let's go back to the Airbnb. We can call Detective Marshall first thing in the morning. Robert looked back at Timber Treasures one more time. The shop's facade seemed even more sinister under the glow of the street lamps. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. Tomorrow, he whispered. We'll get some answers tomorrow. Their Airbnb was a charming second-floor apartment inside a renovated Victorian home just a few blocks away. Painted pale blue with white trim and gabled windows, it was the kind of place that usually brought Helen a sense of calm. Tonight, it only seemed distant and small. As they reached the steps, Helen stopped and squeezed Robert's hand. I'm going to run down to that Chinese restaurant we passed earlier. I need something hot and comforting. Robert nodded. I'll wait here. I need a smoke to clear my head. As Helen disappeared around the corner, Robert sat on the wooden steps and pulled a cigarette from his jacket. Lighting it with steady fingers, he inhaled deeply, letting the smoke settle in his lungs before exhaling into the cooling night air. The ritual calmed his nerves slightly, giving his racing mind something to focus on. The roller blades, that shop, the strange man and the terrified little girl, none of it made any sense. But it was real, tangible. After 20 long years of silence and false leads, they had finally found something solid. How had Emily's rollerblades ended up in that junk shop? And more importantly, could Emily have ended up there too? The thought rattled him. His hand trembled as he took another drag. Could she still be alive? That hope, buried for 2 decades, now pulsed faintly inside him. But with it came fear. Because if they were close to the truth, what might that truth reveal? Pulling out his phone, he searched for information about Victor Manson and Timber Treasures. There wasn't much to go on. A bare-bones website listed the shop's address and hours. A few customer reviews praised the store's variety and quirky inventory, but none mentioned the owner by name. Frustrated, he was about to give up when movement across the street caught his eye. A figure lingered near a lamppost, barely visible in the dim light. He squinted. It was a child, a girl. She looked to be around 10 or 11, standing motionless in the shadows. Her posture was tense, her hands clutched in front of her. Robert extinguished his cigarette and stood slowly. "Hello?" he called, trying to keep his voice soft and non-threatening. "Are you all right?" The girl flinched at first, then took a hesitant step forward. She was thin, too thin, and wore oversized clothes that hung awkwardly on her small frame. Her hair, a dirty blonde, was pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked up at Robert with eyes that were wide and far too serious for her age. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. "Are you looking for someone?" The girl's lips parted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, sir," she said, "can you help me?" Robert crouched down slightly to meet her eye level. "Of course. What's your name?" Her eyes darted around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. Then she leaned in closer. "Can you help me save my sister? A bad man took her." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, yanking him from the fog of uncertainty into hyper-awareness. He immediately glanced around, heart hammering. Was this some sort of trap? A ploy to draw his attention while someone else slipped past him and into the apartment. But the street was still. There were no unfamiliar cars idling with engines running, no shadowy figures watching from alleyways. It was quiet, too quiet for anything nefarious to be happening just out of sight. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching to meet the girl's wide, wary eyes. "Carla," she said, her voice small but determined. "Please, I need help. Nobody believes me." Robert's pulse thudded in his ears. "Who sent you here, Carla?" "No one sent me," she replied quickly, defensively. "I'm alone. I ran away from the orphanage. I had to find my sister. I saw her today, but I was too scared to help her alone." Robert's thoughts spun. An orphan, a missing sister, the symmetry to his own tragedy chilled him. This wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. "Your sister," he asked, voice low. "Where did you see her?" "In the market," Carla said, almost breathless. "She was with the man in the cowboy hat, the one with thinning hair. She's scared of him, but she acts like she's not." Robert's breath caught. The girl with the pigtails. The one who had flinched when that man had touched her hair. "This man," Robert said carefully. "Tall, thinning hair, leather jacket." Carla nodded fervently. "That's him. He took Jasmine from the orphanage. He told the nuns he was adopting her, but it's not true. He's lying. He's a bad man." Robert felt like he was drowning in the flood of information. Emily, her rollerblades, that child's flinch, and now Carla, frightened, desperate, and very possibly the only person standing between her sister and something unspeakable. "Do you know where they took your sister?" he asked urgently. Carla nodded. "I followed them before. I know where they stay, but I can't get her out, not alone." Robert's conscience screamed for him to call the police. This wasn't his fight, not directly. It could be dangerous, illegal, messy. The right thing, the safe thing, was to report it, to let the proper authorities intervene. But he also knew the weight of helplessness, the ache of waiting for someone to act while the seconds ticked by and a child vanished forever. He had lived that agony, and now, standing on the edge of something too familiar to ignore, he couldn't walk away. "I'm going to help you," he said, his decision final. "Let me grab my car." He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to Helen. "Taking the car for a bit, something urgent, use your key, start dinner without me, be back soon." He hesitated only a second before hitting send. They climbed into the rental car and buckled in. As he turned the ignition, Robert felt a mix of dread and resolve tighten in his chest. He was potentially stepping into a storm, but he would rather face it head-on than live with the guilt of inaction. Carla guided him through Fern Creek's quieter streets, directing him with short-clipped instructions. The town's charm faded as they left the market behind. Houses grew sparser, the distance between street lamps increasing. The road narrowed, flanked by a line of trees that gradually thickened into a small wooded patch. "It's just up here," Carla said, pointing toward a graveled drive that curved behind the tree line. Robert pulled in and killed the engine. Ahead, a small RV park nestled among the trees came into view, several old campers and trailers arranged in a rough semicircle. At the far end, a single camper van stood apart from the others. Its windows glowed faintly yellow. "That's the one," Carla whispered. Robert hesitated, his hand on the door handle. "Carla," he said gently, "are you absolutely certain? This is serious. If we're wrong—" "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Please, we have to help Jasmine." Against his better judgment, Robert stepped out. "Stay close," he instructed. "If anything feels off, we leave, no questions asked." Together they approached the camper. Robert's heart pounded with every step. The silence was unnerving. No music, no laughter, not even the sound of a TV. He raised a fist and knocked. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. Harder. The door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, the warm light from inside outlining his silhouette. Robert recognized him immediately. It wasn't the man in the cowboy hat, but the other one. His companion from earlier at the car. The man's eyes widened at the sight of Carla, then narrowed sharply when they landed on Robert. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. "What do you want?" "My name is Robert," he said calmly, fighting to keep his voice even. "This girl came to me for help. She says her sister is being held here." The man stepped fully into view, crossing his arms. "Name's Mike, and whatever that kid told you, she's wrong. Nobody's being held here. Jasmine was adopted legally. I'm just the assistant. My boss is the one who adopted her." He glanced at Carla with annoyance. "This one's been making a fuss ever since. She can't accept that her sister moved on." "That's not true," Carla burst out, her voice sharp with emotion. "You took her, you and the man in the hat. You tricked everyone." Robert turned to Mike. "So your boss adopted her?" "Yeah," Mike replied, the irritation in his tone growing. "We picked her up together because he's out of town now. My brother helped. Everything's above board." Robert struggled to parse the situation. The man sounded reasonable. Everything he said could be legitimate. But the fear in Carla's eyes told a different story. "Look," Robert said slowly, "maybe we can clear this up if I could just speak to your boss. Or maybe let the girls talk, just for a moment. A goodbye, if nothing else." Mike's demeanor turned cold. "That's not possible. Jasmine's already gone. She left earlier tonight, taken to her new home." Robert felt his stomach drop. "Gone?" he echoed. "By who?" "By car. Another one, not this one," Mike said flatly. "She's not here anymore." Carla's face fell, and her shoulders sagged. Robert's hands clenched into fists. He didn't know who was lying, or what exactly was being hidden, but something was deeply wrong. As Mike stood blocking the camper door, something subtle caught Robert's attention. A faint, nearly imperceptible sound from within. It was soft, like fabric brushing against skin, followed by a whispered hush and what might have been the trembling voice of a child. Robert's posture shifted. He wasn't the only one who heard it. Mike's head jerked slightly toward the interior before snapping back to meet Robert's gaze. "That's just my kid," he said quickly, voice strained with forced casualness. "Look, I'm telling you, take that girl back to St. Catherine's before you end up in trouble for child endangerment, whoever you are. You've got no business taking a minor out of town without authorization." "I wasn't trying to kidnap anyone," Robert said defensively. "She came to me for help." "Help?" Mike scoffed, stepping half out of the camper. "You think this is helping? Chasing shadows based on some runaway's wild stories? You're lucky I'm not already on the phone with the cops. Return her to the orphanage? Next time, I won't be so nice." With that, he slammed the camper door shut, the sound reverberating into the silence of the woods. Robert stood there, stunned. The man's explanation on the surface was rational, plausible even, but it didn't sit right. That noise. Shushing. A whisper. It wasn't the noise of a child playing or relaxing. It was a sound of fear. "He's lying," Carla said with conviction, her voice shaking. "Jasmine's in there. I swear it." Robert looked at her, torn. "You heard what he said. Your sister was adopted. Maybe it's hard to accept, but—" "No!" Carla stomped her foot, her eyes fierce and wet with unshed tears. "That's not true. Please, you have to believe me." He sighed, the weight of indecision heavy in his chest. The logical thing would be to drive her back to the orphanage, hand her over safely, let the authorities sort everything out. But logic had failed him before. 20 years ago, when his own daughter had disappeared, logic had told him to trust the system, trust the procedures. That trust had yielded nothing but years of silence. "Let's go back to the car," he said finally. "We'll figure this out." Inside the vehicle, Robert tried to center himself. He looked over at Carla, who sat curled in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression etched in stubborn defiance. "Carla," he said softly, "I understand you're scared. You miss your sister. But I have to take you back. I could get in real trouble just for driving you here." She turned to him with tear-glossed eyes. "Please don't take me back," she whispered. "Not without Jasmine. I promised her I'd protect her." Robert's chest tightened painfully. That promise? He had once made the same one. He could still see Emily's beaming face as she tried her rollerblades for the first time. He had sworn he would always keep her safe. He had failed. And that failure haunted him every single day. "How about this?" he offered gently. "Let's get some dinner. Something warm. You've got to be hungry. Then I'll drive you back, no trouble, I promise." Carla nodded slowly, wiping her face with her sleeve, though the resignation in her eyes never left. Robert turned the key, ready to pull out, when headlights blazed across the windshield. He looked up. The camper van, Mike's van, had come to life. Its headlights cut a sharp white arc through the trees as it slowly pulled out of its spot and began driving down the dirt path. "They're leaving," Robert murmured. As the camper passed, Robert caught a fleeting glimpse through a side window. A curtain parted, and behind it stood a woman. Her face was half obscured, but for one impossible moment she looked directly at him. Auburn hair, slender features, green eyes. Robert's heart stopped. "Emily," he whispered, barely able to say the name. It couldn't be. And yet, it could. There was something about her, The way her brow tilted slightly inward, the distinct shape of her nose, the curve of her lips. It was like seeing the grown version of the girl from his memories, or the face from all those age-grass-planted photos, calculated guesses that had long adorned flyers and websites. Without a word, he threw the car into gear and pulled out, keeping the camper van within sight but at a cautious distance. "What are you doing?" Carla asked, her back straightening in her seat. "I saw someone," Robert said, barely trusting the words as they left his mouth. "A woman. Someone who might be my daughter." Carla blinked. "Your daughter?" Robert nodded, eyes locked on the red glow of the camper's taillights. "Emily disappeared 20 years ago. She was 12, just like Jasmine. I thought she was safe. We all did." As they drove, Robert's phone lit up. Helen's name appeared on the screen. He answered immediately, putting it on speaker. "Robert, where are you?" Helen's voice crackled through the car, tense and worried. "I've been waiting for you." "Helen," he said quickly, "you're not going to believe this. I think I saw Emily. I'm following a camper van. There's a woman inside. She looks just like her." There was a pause. "What? Robert, where exactly are you? Are you sure it's her?" "I'm not sure of anything," he admitted. "But Helen, she looks exactly like we always imagined she would. The same eyes, the same face, just older." Helen's voice broke slightly. "Robert, please, be careful. You don't know who these people are. You don't know what they're capable of." "I have to see this through," he replied, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I have to know." The call dropped suddenly, dead air replacing Helen's voice. The road had taken them beyond cell service, deeper into Fern Creek's outskirts, where the town gave way to dense forests and empty fields. For nearly an hour, they followed the camper down winding rural roads. Carla said little, occasionally pointing to keep them on course. Finally, the van turned off onto a gravel drive, heading toward a large farmhouse set far back from the road. Robert killed the headlights and eased the car to a stop about 100 yards away. Trees offered some cover. He watched in silence as the camper rolled to a stop near the house. Lights flickered on inside. The building was 2 stories tall, farmhouse style, with a wrap-around porch and a detached garage. It looked peaceful, normal, but something about it made Robert's skin crawl. "What do we do now?" Carla whispered, her voice trembling. Robert looked at her, suddenly aware of how surreal and potentially frightening this situation must be to a child. "I'm sorry, Carla," he said softly. "I should have taken you back, but you're not the only one who lost someone." He turned back to the house. "My daughter Emily disappeared 20 years ago, and I've been searching for her ever since." "I think I just saw her," Robert whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "In the camper van. That's why I followed them." Carla's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You think the bad men took your daughter too?" "I don't know," Robert admitted, watching the farmhouse intently. "But I intend to find out." They sat in silence as the camper van came to a slow stop near the front steps of the large house. The porch light clicked on, casting a cone of gold across the gravel. Mike stepped out first, scanning the area. Then came a tall woman, holding a child's hand. The girl walked slowly, her head L.W., but her twin blonde pigtails were unmistakable. "That's her," Carla breathed, pressing her fingers against the window. "That's my sister. That's Jasmine." Robert couldn't look away. His eyes drifted from Jasmine to the woman beside her, tall, graceful, auburn hair catching the porch light. Even from a distance, Robert felt the breath leave his lungs. The way she moved, the way she carried herself. She reminded him so strongly of Helen, of Emily, of every daydream he'd had for the last 2 decades of what his daughter might look like if she'd survived. And then the last figure stepped out of the van. The cowboy hat was gone, but there was no mistaking him now. "Victor Manson," Robert said under his breath, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. It was the same man from the DMV photo, salt and pepper hair, angular jaw, deep-set eyes. "He lied," Robert muttered, more to himself than to Carla. "Mike said Manson was out of town, but he was with them this whole time. And the girl, Jasmine, she had been in the van the entire time as well." The realization settled over him like a heavy fog. If Manson had lied about his whereabouts, what else had he hidden? If that woman truly was Emily, his Emily, what unspeakable things had she endured under his watch? Robert's first impulse was to get out of the car, run to the house, and demand answers. Every fiber of his being screamed to act. But his years of sorrow and caution told him to slow down. He was outnumbered, likely outgunned, and more importantly, he had Carla with him. He couldn't risk putting another child in danger. He reached for his phone, fingers moving instinctively to call Detective Marshall, but the screen was blank. No bars, no signal. They were too far from town, too deep into the countryside. He was alone. No backup, no way to call for help. Just him, Carla, and the truth, waiting behind those walls. A sharp knock on the driver's window made him jump. He whipped his head to the side. Mike stood outside, his face a mask of fury, his eyes burning with suspicion. "Stay in the car," Robert said quickly, keeping his voice calm for Carla's sake. "Lock the doors." He rolled down the window a few inches. "Mike," he greeted, trying to sound composed, "I was just about to leave." "Like hell you were," Mike snarled. "You followed us, all the way out here. What are you, some kind of stalker?" Robert scrambled for words. "The girl just wanted to see her sister, one last time. I thought maybe, if we could talk." "You're trespassing," Mike cut him off. "Private property. I don't know who you think you are, but you've crossed a line." Robert's hand hovered near the ignition. "Let's not do this. We'll go. No harm done." Mike's expression darkened further. "That wasn't a suggestion. You're coming with me. Now." His hand moved to his jacket, tapping the outline of what Robert knew, without needing to see, was a gun. Robert's blood went cold, but he nodded, slowly, deliberately. "All right. No need for trouble." He opened the door and stepped out. Carla followed reluctantly, her eyes locked on the farmhouse. Mike led them across the gravel, the crunch of their footsteps loud in the quiet night. Robert's mind raced, taking in everything. The number of cars, the layout of the yard, possible exits, the width of the tree line. "You're making a mistake," Mike said without looking back. "The boss isn't going to like this." "I just want to understand what's happening," Robert replied, placing a reassuring hand on Carla's shoulder. Before they reached the porch, the front door swung open. Victor Manson stood in the doorway, his expression a twisted sculpture of cold fury. "Who are these people?" he barked at Mike. "The guy was watching the house," Mike explained quickly. "And he brought the girl, the sister." Manson's gaze sharpened, settling on Carla for a moment, then locking onto Robert. "And you?" "My name is Robert Whitmore," he said, squaring his shoulders. "And I think you have someone who belongs to me." Behind Manson, the auburn-haired woman appeared. Her steps faltered as her eyes found Robert. She stopped cold, the color draining from her face. For a long second, she stared, just stared. And Robert stared back. He knew those eyes, knew them as well as his own. "Emily?" he whispered, the name barely audible. At the sound of it, something flickered across her face. Shock, confusion, a tremor of recognition. Then came the sound of sirens, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. Mike cursed and yanked out a radio. "Boss, we've got company. Sounds like cops." Manson's face twisted into rage. "How did they find us?" Robert didn't answer right away, but when Manson turned on him, demanding again, he spoke clearly. "My wife. She knew I was following your van. When I didn't come back, she must have called the police." Lena, Emily, remained in the doorway, frozen. Her eyes never left Robert's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Behind her, expressions swirled, a storm of emotions, recognition, pain, fear, and something else. Hope. "Lena, get inside," Manson barked, but she didn't move. "Emily," Robert said again. "Emily Grace." She swayed slightly at the name, her fingers gripping the doorframe. Manson's rage shifted into something else. Cold calculation. "Mike," he snapped, "get everyone inside, bring them too." Mike grabbed Carla by the arm. Robert tensed but didn't resist. Inside, the house was dimly lit and too quiet. Jasmine sat on a couch, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Carla immediately tried to run to her, but Mike held her back. From the front window, the glow of approaching headlights grew stronger. Sirens wailed just beyond the trees. Time was running out. Flashing red and blue lights sliced through the dark as the first patrol cars rolled up to the edge of the property. The sound of tires crunching gravel, paired with the urgent wail of sirens, turned the tense silence in the house into a charged storm of anxiety. Victor paced the living room, his expression tight. "Mike," he snapped, "what's the plan here?" Mike moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "They've got the whole place surrounded." Without a word, Victor disappeared into a back room. He returned moments later, gripping a handgun. "Tell them we're armed and ready to defend ourselves." Robert's heart thudded. He stood protectively in front of Carla, his pulse hammering against his ribs. This was no longer just a search for answers. It was becoming a standoff. Emily. Lena stood, frozen near the fireplace, her face ashen, her eyes darting from Victor to Robert. The gun in Manson's hand cast a long shadow across the floor, a terrible silhouette that seemed to split the room in half. Fear and courage, silence and truth. Outside, a loudspeaker crackled to life. "This is the Fern Creek Police Department," the voice declared. "We have the house surrounded. Exit the building slowly and with your hands raised. No one will be harmed." "No one moves," Manson barked, swinging the gun toward the front window. "Mike, bring the girl here. Now." Mike grabbed Jasmine by the arm and yanked her across the room. She whimpered, her face pale with fear. Carla screamed and surged forward, but Robert caught her around the waist, pulling her back with both arms. "Let her go," Robert said, forcing calm into his voice. "She's just a child. Whatever this is, leave the kids out of it. This is between the adults." Victor let out a coarse, humorless laugh. "You really don't get it, do you, Whitmore? You should have stayed out of this. You should have turned that little pest over to the cops at the market and walked away." Another announcement from outside. "This is Detective Marshall of Fern Creek PD. Mr. Manson, we know you're in there. Step out with your hands visible. We want to resolve this peacefully." Victor turned to the woman by the fireplace. "Lena, come here. Tell them everything's fine, that you're here of your own free will, and that the girl, Jasmine, is your adopted daughter." Lena, Emily, hesitated, her lips trembling. Her gaze drifted toward Robert. "Now, Lena," Victor snapped. Slowly, she stepped forward, but stopped halfway across the room. "I can't do this anymore, Victor," she said softly. Victor's brows knitted. "What did you just say?" I said. "I can't keep pretending." Her voice grew louder, steadier, cutting through the charged air like a blade. She turned to face Robert. You're really my father, aren't you?" Robert's chest tightened so painfully he thought he might break. "Yes," he said, nodding through the tears in his eyes. "Emily, it's me. We never gave up, not for one day." Her eyes whitened, shimmering with tears of her own. "Lena, I am warning you," Victor said, his voice dangerously low. "Get over here, now!" Emily shook her head. "No, Victor, it's over. I remember. I remember who I am." Victor's face twisted with rage, and in a split second he turned the gun on Robert. "You did this. You turned her against me." The next few seconds happened in a blur. Emily lunged for Victor, knocking his arm as he fired. The gunshot echoed like thunder in the room. Robert instinctively ducked, pulling Carla down with him. A second shot rang out. Sharp, close, final. When the ringing in Robert's ears faded and he dared to look up, Victor Manson lay slumped on the floor, his shirt blooming red. Emily stood over him, a smaller pistol clutched in her shaking hand. Blood dripped from a graze on her upper arm where the first bullet had clipped her. Without hesitation, Robert rushed to her side and kicked both weapons away. Mike, standing frozen behind the couch, reached into his coat, but before he could act, the front door burst open with a crash. "Police, everyone on the ground." Armed officers flooded the room, yelling commands. Robert dropped to his knees, holding Carla close. Emily raised her hand slowly, still clutching the gun, and placed it on the ground before stepping back with shaking legs. Mike was tackled and disarmed within seconds, his protest drowned by orders and chaos. Paramedics pushed through the door. One team moved immediately to Victor, who was still breathing but barely. Another team reached Emily, assessing the wound and easing her onto a stretcher. She looked at Robert with dazed eyes, her lips moving but no sound escaping. "It's okay," he whispered as she was led away. "You're safe now." Carla ran to Jasmine and hugged her tightly as more officers helped escort the girls into waiting ambulances. Robert remained rooted to the spot, adrenaline draining from his body like melting ice. An hour later, Robert sat in a cold plastic chair outside the treatment room at Fern Creek Medical Center. The hallway buzzed with nurses and orderlies, the dull fluorescent lights casting a weary haze over everything. He hadn't moved from that chair. Not since Emily, his Emily, had been taken inside. Detective Marshall appeared, his expression firm but kind. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "the doctors say your daughter's injury is minor. The bullet grazed her arm, no permanent damage. She'll be just fine." Robert nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "And Manson?" he finally asked. "In surgery. The bullet missed his heart, but he's in critical condition. They're trying to stabilize him." Robert closed his eyes and exhaled a shuddering breath. "The girls, Carla and Jasmine?" he asked. "They're in the pediatric wing with Child Protective Services. Both are unharmed, physically at least, but they've been through a lot." Robert rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in like a weight. "My wife? She arrived an hour ago. She's in the cafeteria. We traced your rental car's GPS. When she couldn't reach you, she called us. That's what led us to the farmhouse." The door to the treatment room swung open. A doctor stepped out, his face neutral but relaxed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "she's stable. We've finished stitching the wound. She's resting comfortably. You can see her now." Robert stood slowly, his legs unsure beneath him. Inside, the room was quiet, dimly lit. Emily lay in the hospital bed, one arm bandaged, the other resting gently across her chest. Her eyes opened as he stepped in. They were green, Helen's green, clear and alert. "Emily," he said, stopping at the foot of the bed, afraid to move closer. She smiled, trembling. "Dad?" she said, her voice catching on the word. That single syllable shattered something deep inside Robert. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hand, carefully, reverently. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered, "not for a single day." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and in that moment, 20 years of pain, searching, and silence finally broke into something that looked like hope. Emily's voice trembled as she looked at her father. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, her eyes filling again. "Victor told me that nobody was looking for me anymore, that you and Mom had died in a car accident. I believed him," her voice cracked. "I was so alone." Before Robert could respond, the hospital door swung open again. Helen entered, holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee, her steps slow and cautious. Her eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on the bed, the cups fell from her hands. Forgotten. They hit the tile floor with soft thuds, spilling brown liquid across the linoleum. "Emily!" Helen breathed, the name escaping her lips as if it were a prayer. Her face paled and then flushed with a cascade of overwhelming emotion. "Mom!" Emily whispered in return, her voice barely audible and childlike. Her lower lip trembled. Helen didn't hesitate. She rushed to the bedside, wrapping her arms carefully around her daughter's shoulders, mindful of the injured arm. The 3 of them held each other, sobbing in silence. For 20 long years they had been trapped in the icy grip of absence, living with questions that never found answers. Now, in this moment, words were unnecessary. They had found each other. Eventually, a soft knock came at the door. Detective Marshall stepped into the room, his voice quiet, respectful of the family's fragile reunion. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we need to begin documenting a statement for the record. Miss Whitmore, unless you'd prefer we use another name?" Emily drew herself up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "My name is Emily Grace Whitmore," she said, her voice steadier now. "He called me Lena, but that was never my name." Robert gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Helen moved to sit beside them, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. Detective Marshall sat across from them and opened his notebook. "Emily, Can you tell me what happened? As much as you're able. For the next hour, Emily shared the story that had haunted her life. She began at the moment everything changed. On that sunny June afternoon when she left her house on rollerblades to visit a friend. There was a man, she said. He pulled up in a truck. He told me there had been a robbery nearby and that it wasn't safe to be out. He said he was with the police and that he'd take me home. She hesitated. I didn't believe him. I tried to get away, but he put a cloth over my face. It smelled strange. That's the last thing I remember. When I woke up, she continued, I was in the back of his truck. We were moving. I didn't know where we were. He kept me hidden in a false compartment. He used back roads, avoided gas stations, and never stayed long anywhere. He was always moving. Why Fern Creek? Detective Marshall asked. He owned the pawn shop here, Timber Treasures. It was his home base, Emily said. He'd come back every few weeks, check on things, get cash. Sometimes he'd trade items for whatever he needed to keep us moving. Helen touched her daughter's knee. You never tried to run? To escape? Emily looked away, her voice faint. I did. Many times, especially in the beginning. But every time he caught me, the punishments got worse. He'd lock me up for days, withhold food, threaten to hurt me. Tears welled in her eyes again. And then, he said no one was looking for me anymore, that you were dead, that the world had forgotten me. Eventually, I stopped trying. I just focused on surviving. Detective Marshall's jaw was set. When did he start calling you his wife? Emily's shoulders tensed. When I turned 18. He said I was old enough. It was time for me to become more useful. He started introducing me to people as Lena, his wife. But he still kept me hidden most of the time. Helen gasped, covering her mouth. And Jasmine? The detective asked gently. Do you know how she came into his care? Emily took a shaky breath. About 6 months ago, I overheard him talking to Mike. He said I was getting too old. He needed someone young. A fresh bud, he called her. He wanted a second girl, someone new. He said he would keep me, but he needed a replacement. Disgust twisted across her face. Emily started searching. A few weeks later, they found Jasmine at St. Catherine's. I don't know how they managed it, if it was a real adoption or if they bribed someone, but I know it wasn't right. It didn't feel right. He brought her home like a trophy. Detective Marshall scribbled notes, his mouth pressed into a grim line. We'll open a formal investigation into St. Catherine's and the state records. If there's corruption or fraudulent paperwork, we'll uncover it. And Timber Treasures. We'll be seizing the records and inventory. There may be links to other missing children or criminal operations. What's going to happen to Victor? Robert asked, his voice laced with quiet fury. He'll be charged with your daughter's abduction, illegal imprisonment, child endangerment, and attempted murder, Marshall said. And that's just the beginning. Depending on what we find, there may be dozens of additional charges waiting. Robert nodded. Good. I want to see him pay for what he did to her. A knock at the door drew their attention. A nurse entered, followed by a woman in a state-issued blazer, Child Protective Services. Behind her stood two small figures, Carla and Jasmine. The girls have been asking for you, the CPS worker said with a soft smile. They've been worried. Carla hurried to Emily's bedside, stopping just short. Are you okay? She asked in a small voice. Did the bad man hurt you real bad? Emily smiled gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. I'll be okay, sweetheart. Just a scratch. What about you and Jasmine? Are you all right? Jasmine peered shyly from behind her sister, her eyes enormous. Are we going back to the orphanage? She whispered. Before the CPS worker could respond, Robert cleared his throat. Actually, he said, I wanted to talk to you about that. He turned to the caseworker. I know we live out of state, and this would be a complicated process with home visits and paperwork, but my wife and I, well, we'd like to help. We want to make sure these girls aren't sent back to a place where something like this could happen again. The worker raised her brows. You're offering to adopt them? We're offering to start the process, Robert said. Or at the very least, to ensure they're placed in a better facility. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they'll be cared for. Emily reached out and took her father's hand, her smile small but radiant. Carla and Jasmine looked up at the adults with cautious hope flickering in their young eyes. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel haunted by loss. It felt like a new beginning. "And I'd like to provide financial support for their care and education," Robert added, his voice firm with conviction. "It's the least I can do." The CPS worker nodded appreciatively. "That kind of assistance would go a long way in helping us find the right placement for Carla and Jasmine. We'll begin exploring options right away." Emily, still reclining in her hospital bed, reached out her uninjured arm and took Carla's hand gently. "You saved me," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "If you hadn't been brave enough to run away and ask for help, I might never have found my way back. I might never have seen my family again." Carla's cheeks flushed with pride. She grinned, a little embarrassed but clearly touched. "You saved my sister too," she replied earnestly. "I think we kind of saved each other." Helen, watching from the chair beside the bed, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Bravery isn't just facing danger," she said. "It's doing what's right, even when it's scary." "Carla, you are one incredibly brave little girl." The CPS worker stood and gathered her paperwork. "We'll talk again in the morning. For now, the girls need rest. I'll check in later tonight and start making arrangements." As dusk deepened into evening, the hospital room took on the atmosphere of a quiet haven, briefly free of the chaos that had defined the last few days. Doctors came by periodically to monitor Emily's wound, which was healing well, and police officers arrived in shifts to update Robert and Helen on the rapidly evolving investigation. Victor Manson had survived emergency surgery but remained in critical condition, unconscious and heavily guarded. Authorities had arrested Mike and 3 other men linked to Manson's illegal activities. Under questioning, they were already beginning to provide information. Names, locations, and a detailed web of criminal operations that spanned several states. Human trafficking, forged documents, stolen identities, and even property fraud. It was more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Back in the room, Helen sat beside Emily's bed, her hand resting gently on her daughter's forearm. 20 years, she whispered, her voice trembling. "There were so many times I thought we'd never see this day." Robert sat on the opposite side, silent, just watching his daughter sleep. Her face, older now, shaped by time and pain, still held the same gentle beauty it had when she was 12. The freckles scattered across her nose, the curve of her mouth. Unmistakably Emily. He nodded slowly, emotion thick in his throat. "Thank you for making me go on this trip," he said quietly to Helen. "I didn't want to leave Rockford. I didn't want to feel anything anymore. But if we hadn't come here—" She took his hand. "We came here because some part of you still hoped. You never stopped hoping." Robert's gaze drifted toward the window, where stars had begun to bloom against the darkening sky. Fern Creek, once just a quiet detour on a reluctant vacation, had become the place where a miracle unfolded. And it all began with a pair of rollerblades. Dusty, forgotten, sitting in a pawnshop window. Proof that faith, however cruel, could still leave behind clues, still open doors long thought sealed. Emily shifted slightly in her sleep, her breathing slow and steady. Robert felt a profound peace settle over him, something he hadn't known in 2 decades. It was still fragile, still tempered by all they had lost, but it was real. He thought of the birthdays missed, the holidays passed in silence, the countless nights lying awake wondering where she was, if she was safe, if she even remembered them. None of those years could be returned. They were lost to the cruelty of a single man's choice. But sitting here, with Helen at his side and Emily just inches away, Robert knew the future was finally theirs again. There would be healing ahead, therapy, painful conversations, adjustments. But there would also be laughter, shared meals, and new memories. He would see his daughter smile again. He would see her rediscover joy. Outside the hospital window, a single bright star twinkled above the town. Robert remembered how Emily, as a child, would race outside at dusk to make wishes on the first stars she saw. She'd close her eyes, hands clasped, and whisper her hopes to the sky. Tonight, he didn't need to make a wish. The miracle he had prayed for, the reunion he had dreamed of through 20 long years of sorrow, was finally real. Emily was home, where she belonged.